The cold was relentless. The wind cut across the frozen wasteland like 1,000 sharp blades, whipping at her small frame and sinking deep into her bones. The human girl shivered violently, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to hold on to warmth. Her boots, thin against the endless stretch of ice and snow, sank slightly with every step, and the effort of moving through the drifts made her feel weaker with each passing moment. She had not expected the expedition to end like this. One moment, she had been surrounded by her team, and the next, the icy wilderness had swallowed her whole, leaving her utterly alone. Her breath formed clouds in the freezing air, each exhale a reminder of her vulnerability. She tried to focus on her surroundings, but the wasteland was a vast, featureless expanse. Snow stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by occasional jagged ice formations that rose like frozen monuments to some ancient, cruel force. She knew the land was dangerous, not just for its cold, but for what might be lurking beneath the surface. Creatures adapted to these extremes could be anywhere, and every shadow seemed alive. Even the silence of the desert made her uneasy. Without the hum of machines or the voices of her companions, the world felt impossibly large, and she impossibly small. Her mind tried to remember the survival training she had been given, but panic gnawed at her focus. She had learned how to build shelters, how to ration food, and how to signal for help. Yet nothing in her training had prepared her for the overwhelming loneliness of this frozen place. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to find cover, to keep warm, but her body was tired. Her legs burned from exertion, her fingers were stiff and nearly numb, and her face ached from the cold that penetrated every layer of her clothing. She paused, sinking to her knees in the snow, her hands digging into the icy crust. For a moment, she allowed herself to give in to despair. Her eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, scanned the horizon, searching for anything familiar, anything that could guide her. But there was nothing. Only endless white, endless cold, endless silence. The hopelessness pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears, and she realized that her own fear was as dangerous as the environment. If she allowed it to consume her, she might not survive another hour. Slowly, she forced herself to her feet. She tried to steady her trembling body and focus on one small goal: movement. One step at a time. Each step was deliberate, cautious, and exhausting. The snow crunched beneath her boots, a harsh sound that seemed to echo through the emptiness. Every step forward felt like a victory, yet at the same time it emphasized how far she was from safety. She tried to recall landmarks she had passed before becoming lost. The slope of a hill, the curve of a ridge. But everything looked the same, washed in white and frozen solid. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and she pressed them together to stop shivering. She whispered softly to herself, a mantra of survival. Keep moving, find shelter, survive. The words were almost drowned out by the wind, but she repeated them, letting the rhythm of speech help her maintain focus. She reminded herself that fear was normal, but surrender was not an option. Even in the face of hopelessness, she had to continue, or the wasteland would claim her. Hours passed, or was it minutes? Time was impossible to measure in this frozen world. The sun, a pale disk barely visible through the thick clouds, offered little warmth. She stumbled over a hidden ridge of ice, falling hard onto her knees. Snow filled her hair and clothing, soaking through her layers. Her hands were stiff and unresponsive, but she forced herself up again, refusing to stay down. Survival required movement, and she would not give the ice the satisfaction of taking her life so easily. As she walked, she tried to remember what had brought her here. The expedition had been a simple research mission: gather samples, document the landscape, and return safely. She had not expected the storm to trap them, or for her companions to be separated. Panic briefly threatened to overwhelm her, imagining the team continuing on, leaving her behind, and she clenched her fists to regain control. She had to focus on what she could do now, not what had gone wrong. The cold was unrelenting. Every part of her body ached. Her fingers had become stiff extensions of ice, her toes numb inside her boots. Every breath burned like fire in her lungs. Yet despite the agony, she pushed forward. She stumbled into a shallow depression, offering a small break from the wind, and took a moment to rest. Snow crunched beneath her, and she realized she was not entirely alone. Her ears twitched at the faint sound of movement, a soft rustling over the snow, almost imperceptible. Her eyes scanned the horizon, but she saw nothing. Perhaps it was the wind. Perhaps it was a small animal. Her heart leapt with hope and also with fear. She had no idea how long she wandered, but eventually, fatigue forced her to stop. She crouched down, pressing herself into the snow, trying to conserve what little warmth she had left. She had no shelter, no fire, no hope of immediate rescue. Her stomach growled painfully from hunger, reminding her that she had nothing to eat. But she forced herself to think positively, imagining that somewhere, someone might be looking for her. Someone might come to help. As night approached, the cold intensified. The pale daylight faded, leaving a dim twilight that barely penetrated the snow clouds. She shivered uncontrollably and pressed herself against a low ice ridge, trying to shield herself from the wind. Her body ached from hours of exertion, and her spirit began to fray. She whispered to herself again, repeating the mantra that had kept her alive. Keep moving, survive, do not give up. The words were fragile, but they were all she had. Then, in the distance, she saw a shadow. At first, she thought it was a trick of her eyes, a mirage caused by exhaustion and cold. But it moved deliberately, with purpose. Her breath caught in her throat. Could it be another human? Rescue? Or something else? She could not tell, and the uncertainty filled her with a mixture of hope and fear. As the shadow approached, she noticed movement beside it. Small, furry shapes bounding over the snow, predator cubs, native to this frozen land. Her fear spiked. She had been trained to avoid them at all costs, to know that they were dangerous. Yet something in their behavior was strange. They did not rush to attack. They paused, sniffing the air, studying her carefully. The girl froze, unsure what to do. She could not run, could not fight, and had no weapon. Instead, she simply stood, shivering but calm. Her calmness, her lack of panic, seemed to intrigue the cubs. Slowly, almost hesitantly, they came closer. The wind howled around them, but within this small circle of moving shapes, a strange quiet descended. The girl extended a trembling hand, not to strike or scare, but simply to reach out. The cubs sniffed, circled, and then one by one settled around her. In that moment, something shifted. The frozen wasteland, which had seemed like a prison, began to feel less hostile. She was no longer entirely alone. The night grew colder, but she and the cubs huddled together. The idea of warmth, safety, or comfort seemed absurd in this harsh land, yet the presence of the animals gave her a fragile sense of hope. She whispered to them softly, and the cubs responded with low, cautious growls. For the first time since she had been stranded, she felt that she might survive the night. The frozen wasteland had been merciless, and her survival had seemed impossible. But in this moment, with predator cubs circling and settling around her, she realized that perhaps, even in the harshest conditions, hope could exist. Even in isolation, unexpected bonds could form. And even in despair, courage, the quiet, steady kind, could endure. The frozen landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, a white desert of ice and snow, with wind that bit through the girl's thin layers. She crouched low, trying to conserve heat, feeling the ache of exhaustion in every muscle. Just. When despair began to creep back into her mind, she noticed movement in the distance. Small shapes bounded across the snow, their shadows flickering in the dim light. At first, she thought it might be her imagination, a trick of the wind and cold. But as they drew closer, the forms became unmistakable. Predator cubs, native to the icy wilderness, were approaching. Her heart raced. She had heard stories about these creatures from the expedition's records, small, yet fiercely intelligent, with sharp claws and teeth designed to hunt in this merciless environment. Most humans avoided them at all costs, yet these cubs did not rush toward her with obvious aggression. Instead, they moved carefully, eyes flicking from her to each other, their movements tentative, measured. There was curiosity in their behavior, a hesitancy that suggested they were as intrigued by her presence as she was frightened by theirs. The girl remained still, her body pressed low, her breathing controlled despite the chill that burned her lungs. Panic would have been natural. Most humans in her situation would have screamed, run, or flailed their arms in defense. But she had learned through brief survival training and a deep understanding of animal behavior that sudden movement would trigger a predator's instinct to attack. She forced herself to calm her mind, focusing instead on slow, steady breaths. Every step of her heart, every beat was a silent promise. Do not panic, do not provoke, survive. The cubs slowed as they approached. Their fur was thick and matted with ice, a natural armor against the cold. Each one had a pair of sharp eyes that scanned her carefully, noting every small motion. They growled softly, a low rumble that vibrated through the snow, not as a threat, but as a signal of caution and inquiry. The girl could hear the delicate crunch of their paws over frozen ridges, the soft hiss of breath escaping their mouths. She did not flinch. She did not make a sudden noise. She remained calm, a silent observer in the icy expanse, and for reasons she could not understand, the cubs mirrored her caution. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every movement was magnified in the vast emptiness, every sound echoing across the frozen plains. The cubs circled her carefully, pausing now and then to sniff the air, to examine her clothing, to test if she was dangerous. They were wary, but not hostile. Their behavior suggested intelligence beyond instinct. They were evaluating, learning, observing. The girl, in turn, observed them. She could see the subtle cues in their bodies, ears flicking toward sounds, tails twitching with focus, noses raised to the wind. She realized that they were assessing her the same way she assessed them, small, unarmed, and surprisingly calm. Minutes passed like hours, but gradually the tension between them began to ease. The cubs stopped circling aggressively and instead lowered their posture slightly, moving with deliberate slowness. Their growls softened into cautious murmurs, their eyes less sharp, more inquisitive. The girl dared a tiny movement, extending her hand slowly, palm open, not toward them in threat, but as an offer. She spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Words of reassurance she hoped they could understand in tone if not in meaning. The wind carried her voice across the icy plains, and the cubs' ears twitched, heads tilting as if they were listening intently. One cub stepped closer than the others, its small paws sinking slightly into the snow. Its nose twitched as it sniffed. The girl's outstretched hand. She did not flinch. She held her hand steady, allowing the cub to examine her scent. A strange trust began to form in that moment, not through force, not through dominance, but through patience and stillness. The cub did not retreat, nor did it attack. It lingered, considering her presence, deciding that she was not a threat. Slowly, the other cubs followed, their curiosity outweighing the lingering instincts of hunger and caution. The girl's mind raced, analyzing every subtle shift in their behavior. She realized that survival in this harsh environment would depend not only on her own strength, but on forming a bond with these creatures. They were intelligent, adaptable, and clearly capable of cooperation. She could not fight them, and she had no weapon. The only option was understanding, patience, and the quiet assertion of calm. She allowed herself a small smile, acknowledging the tiny victory that each hesitant step of the cubs represented. As the cubs drew nearer, she noticed more of their details: the shimmer of their fur against the icy light, the flick of their ears. With each sound, the intelligence reflected in their eyes. They were not mere animals, they were sentient survivors of this harsh land, and they were watching her as closely as she watched them. A mutual understanding began to form, an unspoken agreement. Neither of us is a threat. Together we may endure this night. The temperature continued to drop, and she knew that time was running against her. Frostbite was a real danger, and the wind would soon sap what little strength she had left. Yet the cubs did not scatter. Their presence, initially intimidating, became a shield of sorts, a barrier between her and the endless cold. They moved in patterns that instinctively kept her safe, circling around in a protective rhythm. She began to mimic their subtle movements, shifting slightly to avoid startling them, learning their pace, and becoming part of their cautious rhythm. With every passing hour, the girl's confidence grew. She realized that survival was no longer purely about endurance. It was about connection. The cubs had chosen, through their observation and instincts, to stay near her. She had no words to express gratitude, but her steady breathing, calm movements, and soft murmurs seemed to communicate her intentions. They recognized her as a figure of quiet stability in a land where instability and danger were the norm. Night fell, and the icy plains turned even colder and darker. The girl huddled low, pressing herself against the snow, her arms around herself. The cubs formed a semicircle around her, small bodies pressed to the ground, eyes alert. Even in the face of absolute isolation, the girl no longer felt entirely alone. Their presence gave her hope, a fragile yet powerful assurance that she could endure until help arrived, or until she could find a way to survive on her own. She thought of the expedition, of the people who had left her behind, and of the mistakes that had brought her to this place. But instead of panic or anger, she felt clarity. She understood that survival in the frozen wastes depended on adaptation, observation, and unexpected alliances. The cubs had arrived not as enemies, but as companions. And in this moment, the line between predator and protector began to blur. The night wore on. The wind howled, ice shifted, and snow drifted in slow, relentless waves. Yet within this fragile circle of life and instinct, the girl and the cubs endured. She murmured soft words to them, unsure if they understood, but confident that her tone conveyed her intentions. The cubs responded with quiet movements, sniffing, shifting, and occasionally nudging her gently with their heads. It was a silent dialogue, a negotiation of trust. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, the girl had learned something profound. Survival was not merely about strength, skill, or endurance. It was about understanding, empathy, and patience. The cubs had recognized her resilience, her calmness, and her ability to remain composed under extreme stress. In turn, she had recognized their intelligence, adaptability, and instinct to survive. Together, they had formed a fragile but essential bond that could tip the balance in favor of life over death. And as the pale morning light spread across the frozen wasteland, the girl realized that she was no longer entirely alone. The cubs had accepted her as one of their own, or at least as someone worthy of cautious trust. In this harsh, frozen world, where every step could be the last, she had found allies, not human, not exactly friends, but creatures whose presence could mean the difference between survival and demise. The frozen wastes were quiet, except for the howling wind and the distant crackle of ice shifting under its own weight. The girl shivered, feeling the cold gnaw into her bones. Her small, thin clothing offered little protection, and the snow and ice seemed endless. Survival was no longer just a challenge, it was a race against nature itself. Her body ached, muscles stiffened from the relentless chill, and yet, hope had arrived in the form of the predator cubs. Their presence, tentative at first, had grown into something unspoken, a cautious companionship that both eased her fear and gave her strength. After hours of careful observation, she decided that merely huddling would not suffice. The wind would freeze her alive, and the long night ahead would be unbearable. She needed warmth, a fire. But in a place like this, building a fire was no simple task. Snow and ice covered every surface, and the scant debris of wood and stones was frozen solid. Still, she began to move carefully, mindful of the cubs who watched her every gesture. Her first step was to gather what little materials were available: small splintered wood from broken crates or fallen equipment, frozen reeds and stones that could be used to create sparks. The cubs moved alongside her, tentative but interested. Their claws made light scratches in the snow as they explored the frozen debris, sniffing pieces of wood and circling her. Occasionally, one would nudge a piece closer with its nose, as if to help. The girl paused, surprised, then smiled faintly. These creatures, left alone to survive in this harsh wilderness, were instinctively cooperative. She realized that if she could harness that instinct, they could work together. She knelt on the snow and began arranging the materials in a careful pattern. A small pile of twigs and reeds at the center, surrounded by slightly larger pieces of wood for stability. The cubs watched, heads tilted, their dark eyes focused intently. She pointed at a small group of stones beside her, and then to the pile. One curious cub took a tentative step forward and pawed at the stones. She demonstrated gently, showing how to strike the stones together to create sparks. The cub recoiled at first, then mimicked her movements, carefully nudging one stone against another. Tiny sparks flew, but the snow quickly swallowed them. Undeterred, she worked patiently, demonstrating each step with slow, deliberate motions. The cubs mirrored her, their movements awkward but earnest. It was clear that they were learning, not through words, but through observation and trust. Each spark she managed to produce brought a flicker of hope, not just for warmth, but for connection. She spoke softly to them, whispering encouragement, and although they could not understand the words, the tone carried meaning. Calm, gentle, assuring. The cubs responded with nudges, careful pawing, and low, contented growls that seemed almost like laughter. Hours passed as she taught them to prepare the materials. The wind picked up, and snow began to drift across the ice, covering small piles. She had worked so hard to assemble. Yet the cubs remained patient, adjusting each time the wind scattered the kindling. Together they learned to create a small depression in the snow to shield the fire from the wind. She demonstrated again, arranging the reeds and twigs carefully, and one of the cubs stepped into the role of helper, holding a larger stick in its mouth and gently nudging it into place. Finally, after painstaking effort, she struck the stones. One more time. A tiny spark caught a dry reed, then another, and soon a small flame flickered, weak but alive. The cubs froze in astonishment, watching as the light and heat began to radiate outward. The girl's hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from relief. She had done it. The flame provided warmth against the biting cold, a beacon of safety, in the endless white. She reached toward the cubs, letting the glow of the fire illuminate their thick, furred faces. They approached cautiously, sniffing the warmth and nudging closer. The first moments were delicate. Fire was a new element, unpredictable and dangerous, and the cubs were aware of it. One small paw came too close and recoiled in surprise. The girl gently placed her hand on its head, reassuring it with soft murmurs. Slowly, the cubs settled around the fire, forming a semicircle. Their bodies radiated warmth, and the girl instinctively moved closer to benefit from it. The fire was no longer just a source of heat. It was a gathering point, a symbol of unity between her and the cubs. As night deepened, the girl and the cubs began to take on a rhythm. She would adjust pieces of wood one by one, feeding the small fire to keep it alive, while the cubs brought twigs and debris they found nearby. Occasionally, a cub would dig into the snow to uncover hidden sticks, placing them near the fire. Their instincts for survival and her knowledge for warmth merged seamlessly. Together, they built not just a fire, but a shared understanding, a silent partnership that transcended species. The wind's howl became background music to their efforts. Snowflakes fell lightly, dusting the small fire and the cubs' fur, yet the flames persisted, fed by their combined effort. Each spark, each small burst of flame, reinforced the bond forming between human and cubs. The girl felt a growing sense of pride, not from dominance, but from collaboration. These creatures, once wild and unpredictable, were now companions, participating in a delicate dance of survival. As the night wore on, the warmth from the fire began to penetrate their frozen extremities. The girl's fingers regained some mobility, and the cubs shifted closer, sharing heat in a cooperative embrace. She murmured softly, telling them they had done well, and though they could not understand her words, the tone was comforting. It was a quiet affirmation of their growing trust. A trust built not on coercion, but on patience, calm, and shared purpose. By the time she leaned back against the snow to rest, the fire had grown strong enough to cast a golden glow across the frozen plain. The cubs lay down near her, their bodies pressed close, shielding her from the wind and conserving their shared warmth. She marveled at the scene. The predators, once feared for their ferocity, had become guardians, collaborators, and companions. The ice and snow, once symbols of isolation and despair, now framed a moment of connection and hope. The girl realized something profound in those quiet hours. Survival in the frozen wastes was not merely a matter of strength or skill. It required understanding, empathy, and adaptability. The cubs had recognized her calmness, her patience, and her willingness to cooperate. In turn, she had recognized their intelligence, curiosity, and capacity for trust. Together, they had built more than a fire. They had built a bond, one that might very well mean the difference between life and death in the harsh world around them. Night continued to deepen. Stars scattered across the clear sky above, glittering cold and distant. But within the circle of fire, warmth, and trust, the girl and the cubs felt a sense of belonging. They were no longer isolated individuals battling the frozen wastes. They were a small unit, united by necessity, instinct, and care. The fire flickered, sending shadows across the snow, illuminating the small forms of predator and human huddled together, a tableau of unexpected companionship. As she drifted into a light sleep beside the fire, the girl thought about the long days ahead. Survival would still be a challenge, but for the first time, she felt less fear, less hopelessness. She had allies in this desolate place. She had learned that even in the most extreme conditions, connection, patience, and mutual respect could transform danger into safety. The cub's eyes, glowing softly in the firelight, were a constant reminder. She was not alone. When dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the snow with pale shades of pink and orange, the fire still burned, tended carefully by small paws and gentle hands. The girl knew that the night had changed something fundamental. They had survived together, learned from each other, and established a foundation of trust. The frozen wasteland, once a place of despair and isolation, had become the setting for a small but significant alliance, one that might carry them through countless hardships to come. In the morning light, she looked at the cubs and smiled. They were no longer wild, distant creatures. They were collaborators, allies, and silent companions. Each movement, each gesture, each careful adjustment of the firewood had reinforced a bond that would not easily be broken. The girl understood clearly that this experience had changed her, not just in terms of survival skills, but in the way she viewed connection, trust, and patience. The cubs had taught her lessons that no manual could provide, the value of calm, observation, and mutual support. And as the sun rose higher, warming the snowy plains ever so slightly, she realized that the fire they had built together was more than warmth. It was a symbol of their partnership, a testament to the power of trust in the face of adversity. In this frozen wasteland, she had found guardians in the predator cubs, friends she had never expected, and a lesson in resilience that would guide her in the days to come. The days in the frozen wasteland were long, harsh, and merciless. The wind cut like knives, snow drifted across the endless expanse, and the temperatures plunged to a depth that made breathing painful. Yet amidst the vast emptiness, a fragile rhythm began to form. The girl, once utterly alone, now had companions. The predator cubs who had found her in the snow shared her warmth and joined her in survival. Together, they began to navigate the harsh world, learning not only how to endure but how to thrive through cooperation. Each morning, she would wake to the gentle nudges and soft growls of the cubs. They had taken it upon themselves to stay alert, patrolling the area for any signs of danger. She would stretch her stiff limbs, then check the small shelter they had built together, a makeshift structure of ice blocks, snow-packed walls, and a carefully maintained fire pit. The cubs would sit nearby, their ears twitching, their eyes scanning for threats. They had quickly learned that the wasteland was full of dangers far beyond hunger: sudden blizzards, collapsing ice, and predatory creatures that roam the frozen plains. The first task each day was maintaining warmth. The fire they had built together remained central to their survival. The girl and cubs worked in tandem, gathering dry reeds, splintered wood, and frozen branches that could be used to fuel the flames. The cubs proved surprisingly adept at finding suitable materials, pawing them free from snow and dragging them closer to the fire. The girl would then arrange the fuel, demonstrating the careful placement needed to keep the fire burning steadily. Occasionally, a spark would catch too quickly and flare dangerously, and she would gently guide the cubs to step back, using soft words and gestures to teach them caution. Once warmth was secured, they moved on to food. The girl had to learn quickly how to forage in the icy terrain, and she shared her knowledge with the cubs in ways they could understand. They learned to watch her movements, observe her foraging techniques, and assist where they could. She would crack frozen berries from hardy shrubs, and the cubs would carry small pieces back to the shelter. When she fashioned crude traps for small animals, the cubs would stay nearby, offering their keen senses to help detect prey. Their hunting was not driven by malice but necessity, and their teamwork ensured that everyone had enough to eat. The bond between the girl and the cubs deepened with every shared experience. She began to read their instincts, noticing subtle signals: the tilt of a head when danger approached, the flick of a tail indicating curiosity, the low rumble that expressed contentment. She learned to anticipate their needs, guiding them with gestures, soft murmurs, and gentle touches. In turn, the cubs learned to trust her guidance. They followed her directions instinctively, responding to her calm presence rather than commands. The cubs had once been wild, untamed predators, but now they were partners, attuned to her movements and emotions. One particularly harsh night, a sudden blizzard swept across the wasteland, blanketing the landscape in snow and reducing visibility to nearly zero. The girl shivered violently, her small body at the mercy of the biting wind. But the cubs acted instinctively, forming a tight circle around her to shield her from the storm. They huddled close, pressing their warmth against her and each other. She wrapped her arms around them in return, feeling a surge of gratitude and awe. This small unit, bound by trust and survival, had become a family in the cold emptiness. During the daylight hours, they continued to explore the surrounding terrain. The cubs were agile and curious, leaping across ice ridges and sniffing every crevice for hidden resources. The girl followed, learning which areas were safe, which were dangerous, and where the best materials for building or fire could be found. She often marveled at their instinctive knowledge of the frozen environment, their senses finely tuned to detect changes in the ice or the presence of predators. By observing them, she learned much about survival that no human training could have taught her. Their shelter also evolved over time. The girl carefully packed snow into walls, creating windbreaks, while the cubs helped by carrying loose blocks and debris. Together they carved out a small space that protected them from the harshest storms. They even dug shallow trenches around the perimeter to divert drifting snow, an instinctive design that the cubs seemed to understand and follow. The result was a modest but effective refuge, a tiny bastion of warmth and safety amid the endless ice. Mealtimes became rituals of cooperation. The girl would prepare portions, and the cubs would share, never selfishly consuming more than needed. Sometimes they would even protect the scraps for one another, nudging a piece toward a cub that hadn't eaten yet. It was a silent, unspoken understanding. Survival meant unity, not competition. The girl learned to appreciate their intelligence, their ability to act collectively, and their loyalty. She spoke softly to them during these moments, not for them, to understand words, but because her tone reinforced calm and trust. The cubs also helped protect her from the occasional wild predators that ventured too close. Wolves, scavenging beasts, or larger predators of the icy plains would appear on the horizon, but the cubs would growl, circle, and chase them away. The girl observed their tactics carefully, learning from them. She realized that even though she was small and unarmed, her alliance with the cubs gave her a new kind of strength. Alone, she would have been defenseless, but together, they were formidable. Beyond survival, there was also a deeper sense of companionship. The girl would speak softly to them, recounting memories of warmth, family, or distant human life. Though the cubs could not understand her words, they seemed to sense emotion, responding with gentle nuzzles or quiet presence. The harsh world of ice and wind no longer felt entirely cruel. It had become a place where trust, patience, and mutual care could create moments of safety and even comfort. As days turned into weeks, this routine became instinctive. She and the cubs moved as one unit, reading each other's cues, anticipating each other's needs, and adjusting to the challenges of the frozen wastes together. The girl realized that she had changed. Fear had been replaced by calm awareness, isolation had been replaced by companionship, and despair had been replaced by a sense of purpose. The cubs were no longer just animals. They were her allies, teachers, and friends. By now, the little fire that had first marked their bond was a symbol of their unity. Its flames danced and flickered through the long nights, illuminating the cub's fur and her worn face, reminding them that even in a harsh, frozen world, warmth and cooperation could create a haven. She would watch them as they lay curled together, the fire between them, and feel a quiet pride. They had survived not by strength alone, but by working together. One night, as the aurora borealis lit the sky in soft waves of green and violet, the girl sat beside the fire, the cubs resting around. Her. She looked out over the icy expanse and reflected on how far they had come. Once, she had been completely alone, facing death and despair. Now, she had allies, protection, and a sense of belonging. The predator cubs were no longer wild threats. They were her partners in survival, their loyalty unwavering, their trust absolute. She realized that the frozen wasteland, once a symbol of isolation and danger, had become a classroom. The cubs had taught her lessons in observation, patience, and instinct. She had taught them lessons in calmness, compassion, and the value of cooperation. Together, they had created a system of survival that went beyond the simple mechanics of staying alive. It was a bond built on respect, understanding, and trust, a bond that would endure beyond the frozen wastes themselves. By the end of their time in the shelter each day, as the fire dwindled to glowing embers, they would huddle together. The girl felt a warmth that went beyond physical comfort. It was emotional, a profound sense of connection that reassured her that she was not alone. The cubs would close their eyes, relaxed and safe, trusting her guidance, while she felt protected by their silent presence. In this small circle of fire, snow, and companionship, the girl discovered a new kind of strength. It was not brute force, nor speed, nor weapons. It was patience, understanding, and the ability to connect across differences. The predator cubs had taken her in, protected her, and created a partnership that transcended species. She had learned to read them as surely as they had learned to read her, creating a unity that was rare, fragile, and powerful. When the dawn broke on yet another frozen morning, casting pale light across the white landscape, she and the cubs prepared for the day. Their routines were seamless, maintaining the fire, gathering food, scouting the area, and protecting one another. Each day reaffirmed their bond, proving that cooperation was more valuable than isolation and trust more powerful than fear. The girl knew with quiet certainty that they could face anything the frozen wastes threw at them as long as they worked together. By now, survival had become second nature. Each movement, each shared task, each moment of silence around the fire reinforced a bond that had begun with curiosity and patience. The girl had learned that life in this harsh environment was not only about endurance, it was about connection, mutual reliance, and the subtle art of understanding others, even when words could not bridge the gap. In the frozen wastes, life was hard and cruel, yet within the circle of the girl and her predator cubs, a tiny haven existed, a place where warmth, trust, and cooperation created strength stronger than fear. They had transformed the icy wilderness into a home, not just of survival, but of shared life. And as she looked at their fur glinting in the firelight and their attentive eyes reflecting trust and loyalty, the girl understood that this bond would endure long after the frost had melted. The frozen wasteland stretched endlessly, a world of white and gray where survival seemed impossible. Yet in the middle of this harsh expanse, a remarkable scene had formed. The human girl, once small, cold, and alone, had not only endured but thrived, guided by her patience, courage, and the unexpected allies she had found, the predator cubs. Her bond with these creatures had transformed the frozen plains from a place of despair into a sanctuary of cooperation. When the rescuers finally arrived, they were expecting a grim scene. Reports had described a lone human stranded in the ice, possibly frozen or already lost to the cold. They had prepared for a rescue operation under the assumption that they would have to battle the harsh conditions and bring back a frost-bitten survivor clinging to life. What they found, however, defied all expectations. Instead of a shivering, fragile girl, they saw someone standing tall, alert, and alive. Around her, the predator cubs circled, their postures protective yet calm, their low growls and attentive. Stares were not threats to the rescuers, but clear signals. This human was their leader, their chosen companion, the one they had guarded through wind, snow, and danger. The girl's calm eyes met those of the rescuers, and in that instant, they realized she had become something more than a survivor. She was a figure of resilience, courage, and leadership. The cubs had learned to follow her silently, to watch her every movement, and to anticipate her needs. If she moved to gather firewood, they would scout the area and fetch branches. If she bent down to inspect the ice for signs of prey or danger, they would stay close, their senses alert. The girl had taught them through calm gestures, soft words, and consistent care, and the cubs had responded with unwavering loyalty. In the harshest environment imaginable, a deep bond had formed, one that transcended species. As the rescuers approached, the cubs did not retreat or attack. Instead, they shifted subtly, creating a protective ring around the girl. Their stance said, "She is ours. She is safe with us." The human understood immediately that these creatures saw her not as prey, but as their leader, their protector, and their guide. The rescuers, watching this unusual formation, felt a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had trained for emergency situations, seen countless survival scenarios, but nothing like this. A human and alien predators living in unity, surviving as a team in a place where most would perish alone. The girl smiled softly at the cubs, and they responded with small nudges and gentle growls, their way of communicating reassurance. She knelt briefly, letting her hands brush through their fur, reinforcing the trust that had taken days to build. This display of calm authority and mutual respect was the culmination of everything they had endured together. The freezing nights, the hunger, the storms, the constant struggle to survive. Together they had not only endured, they had conquered the challenges of the frozen wilderness through unity. When the rescuers finally stepped closer, one of the cubs raised its head and let out a long, low call, not of aggression, but of acknowledgement. It was a signal to the girl, who nodded imperceptibly, and the cubs stepped aside just enough to allow the humans to approach. Even in this moment, the relationship remained clear. She was the leader, and the cubs' loyalty to her was absolute. The rescuers moved carefully, respecting the bond, and realized that any attempt to separate them forcibly could have been disastrous. Over the next hours, as the rescuers worked to pack the girl safely and prepare for the journey back to civilization, they observed the seamless cooperation between her and the cubs. She coordinated movements, ensuring that the cubs were safe and warm, even as she was guided onto a sled. They mimicked her directions naturally, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The human and her alien companions had formed a team, so cohesive that their survival had been guaranteed in a way that brute strength or technology could not replicate. Stories of her ordeal spread quickly once she returned to a place of relative safety. The media, fellow explorers, and scientists marveled not only at her survival, but at the extraordinary connection between her and the predator cubs. What had begun as a desperate, life-threatening situation had evolved into a tale of compassion, patience, and unity. The girl's actions had shown that leadership is not about dominance or violence. It is about presence, empathy, and the ability to inspire trust. Experts studying the event noted the cubs' behavior as extraordinary. In the wild, they were instinctively aggressive, especially when hungry or cornered. Yet in the presence of the girl, their instincts had been tempered by trust and recognition of her calm, guiding authority. They had chosen to protect, to cooperate, and to follow. An unprecedented act that blurred the line between predator and protector. The human had turned what could have been isolation and fear into a mutual understanding that saved lives. The girl herself remained humble about her experience. She did not boast of leadership or heroism. She simply described the days in the frozen wasteland as a series of small choices made with care, patience, and a constant awareness of the cubs' needs. She spoke of learning from them, observing their instincts, and responding not with fear, but with calm. The cubs, she explained, were teachers as much as companions. They had shown her how to endure, how to anticipate danger, and how trust could transform even the harshest circumstances. Over time, the story of the girl and the predator cubs became legend. It was told in training programs, survival courses, and scientific studies as an example of cooperation across boundaries, resilience under extreme conditions, and the power of empathy. Illustrations depicted the girl surrounded by the cubs, the flickering firelight reflecting in their fur, the endless ice stretching into the distance, a visual testament to what patience, courage, and mutual trust could achieve. The legend also inspired a broader understanding of human potential. It demonstrated that survival was not only about physical strength, technology, or weapons, but about relationships and understanding. In the girl's case, the predator cubs became extensions of her awareness, guardians who had transformed fear into protection, aggression into loyalty, and isolation into unity. Those who heard her story were reminded that even in the most hostile environments, strength could be drawn from compassion, patience, and the willingness to cooperate with those different from oneself. As the girl looked back on her time in the frozen wasteland, she realized that the cubs had changed her as much as she had changed them. She had discovered resilience she never knew she possessed, patience she had not practiced before, and the ability to lead not through force, but through calm presence and understanding. The predator cubs, in turn, had learned to trust a human, completely, setting aside instinctual fear and hunger to create a new form of loyalty. In the end, the legend of her survival became more than a story of endurance. It was a tale of unity. The human girl and the predator cubs showed that bonds could be formed even across the widest divides, that life could be protected and enriched through trust, and that even in a frozen wasteland, warmth could be found in the fire of companionship. The cubs, once wild and untamed, had become guardians. The girl, once isolated and helpless, had become a leader. Together, they had proven that compassion and cooperation were the strongest forces of all. Even years later, the tale continued to inspire explorers, scientists, and ordinary people alike. Paintings, holographic recreations, and written accounts captured the image of the girl surrounded by loyal predator cubs, the fire casting shadows across the ice, illustrating that survival was not merely a physical challenge, but a test of heart, patience, and unity. The lesson endured. Courage paired with trust can create allies in the most unlikely places, turning desperation into legend. The human girl's story, once thought to be a simple survival tale, had become a timeless example. It reminded everyone that even in extreme conditions, relationships mattered more than isolation, understanding more than aggression, and unity more than fear. The predator cubs, symbols of instinct and wildness, had chosen a human as their companion, protector, and guide. Their bond had rewritten the rules of survival, showing that even in a world ruled by harshness and danger, compassion and cooperation could triumph. When the girl finally returned to civilization, she carried with her the lessons of the frozen wastes. She spoke of the cubs, of patience, of calm in the face of danger, and of the power of mutual trust. She had learned that leadership was not about commanding fear, but about inspiring confidence and loyalty through presence and care. The predator cubs remained with her until they could be safely returned to their natural habitat. But the bond forged in the ice would never be forgotten. The story, retold countless times, concluded with the same lesson. Strength is not measured in isolation, weapons, or sheer force. True strength lies in unity, compassion, and the courage to trust and be trusted. The girl had survived the frozen wasteland not alone, but with allies who had once been strangers, who had once been wild, and who had chosen to follow her not because they were forced, but because they recognized her heart. That recognition turned survival into legend and fear into enduring respect.